very much to introduce Jim Wallace and another colleague here, Wallace Best. And I hope what we'll have this afternoon is a really good opportunity for a lot of questions and interaction and engagement and real discussion over the issues that are brought up here. I think they'll be important to all of us. It's an interesting experience to introduce Jim Wallace. I first heard him speak about 25 years ago when I actually stopped and thought about it. And it was shortly after I had come across a book, and I can't even recall at this point how I came across it, that was called An Agenda for Biblical People. And I look back, and I think it was published in the late 70s, and I probably came across it in the around 1980 perhaps, and heard Jim speak shortly afterward. And the interesting part of my experience was growing up in the evangelical circles that I did. This is the first time I had ever heard the language of social justice addressed. And there were two things that Jim did in that talk that I attended at that time that have stuck with me ever since. One of them was, and I had to confirm that this wasn't going to happen today, so I didn't steal anyone's thunder. But one of the things that happened was Jim to hold up a Bible where all the references to the poor and to poverty had been cut out, and just sort of hold it up, and it barely hangs together. It's just something that falls apart in tatters. If you've never seen this, it's a remarkable experience. Maybe it's worth it to try it for yourself some point. It's really a remarkable thing to see. And then to sort of compare this with certainly what was in my own evangelical experience, the utter absence of this kind of conversation in the churches. And then the other point that I remember hearing, and this was something quite new for me as well, and you can correct me on the details if I get this wrong, it's been a while, but I remember Jim talking about growing up in Detroit or being in Detroit, and one of his early experiences being in the African American community that really stayed with him. And this was what the kind of advice that mothers would give to their children. And the example was how growing up in the largely suburban, largely white neighborhoods that certainly that I grew up in Texas and those of us from other places, the advice was, if you ever get in trouble, look for the police. They'll help you. And Jim recalled being in inner city Detroit and hearing another kind of advice from an African American mother that said, if you ever get in trouble and you see the police, hide until they go away. And recognizing what a disjunct this was in our own experience and how this might help us think about the disjunct in our experiences of race here in this country. And again, comparing that with the utter absence of such conversations in my own upbringing was quite stunning. So it's with pleasure, I think, that I introduce Jim. His most recent book that he's been working on is God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It. So I hope all of you pick up a copy of that. Previous books have been Faith Works, How Faith-Based Organizations Are Changing Lives, The Soul of Politics, A Practical and Prophetic Vision for Change, copies of that I've passed out many times. And then going back to Agenda for Biblical People, which is I see here 1976, and it's still worth a very good read, so I would encourage you to do so. Jim spends his time now traveling, still on the board of Sojourners magazine, speaks at over 200 events a year, and is continuing to work toward building something of a faith-based movement of progressive evangelicals to recapture the voice of evangelical politics in this country. So that being said, let me welcome.
Well, thank you. This is very familiar turf. I'm in this room every Monday in the fall from 12 to 3, and we have a great conversation about this very topic. So this is like home, coming back home. I really want to start by really with an apology. This is the kind of conference I would have wanted to be at the whole time and hear all the papers and interact with the other presenters and all of you. I'll get the tapes and the papers when I have a chance, but it's been one of the, this is kind of the endless book tour. It just never ends, and so we did 6 cities this week in 6 days, and I hate to cruise into something like this and just cruise in and and cruise out again, but I apologize if my remarks show ignorance of what has been already said before. I apologize for that, but maybe I can turn it into a bit of a contribution to tell you what I'm hearing and seeing around the country on your topic. and maybe some of that can be grist for our mill this afternoon. But I am very glad to be here and part of this project. We've been having town meetings disguised as book signings across the country, and revivals in bookstores, even a few altar calls in bookstores. In Marin County, the bookstore owner said, "I'm a Jewish Buddhist and I'm signing up." And I want to do a bit of self-disclosure, something I normally say in these town meetings, but I'll start by saying it here. I really am, as I often say, a 19th century evangelical, born in the wrong century. Because in the 19th century, evangelicals were revivalists and reformers. They were evangelists and abolitionists. They fought against slavery. They fought for women's suffrage. They fought for child labor law reform. And it was a powerful movement. In fact, the church historians will tell you that something isn't revival until it changes the society in which it is in. So spiritual renewal by itself is not revival. And Billy Graham, to his credit, never calls what he has done revival. He'll tell you this is spiritual renewal, but it is yet to change the society in a direct way, which is what revival is. But in the 19th century, there was revival, and it was prompted by evangelical initiative, and of course in the century before in Great Britain as well. Now, Charles Finney probably is my hero of that day. He was the evangelist, the Billy Graham of his day, and he actually, I'm told by scholars, invented the altar call. It was Charles Finney, the altar call with which we're all so familiar. The reason he did so, invented the altar call, was because he wanted to get the names and addresses of his converts to sign them up for the anti-slavery campaign. Now think about that. The altar call was to sign people up for the anti-slavery campaign. I love that. So my favorite part of the town meeting is when I say that the publisher hates this part. I said, whether you buy a book or not tonight, I want your name. I want your names. And students, I say, give me your emails. We do email altar calls on campuses now. I said, I know your email is like your essence. It's your connection to the world, but I want your email. So we're developing a very powerful database. We've added, I think, 50,000 emails just since this book tour started. So we're doing altar calls in a new context for a new generation. I have a 6-year-old son named Luke, and just before the election, we were working the streets of our Columbia Heights neighborhood, trick-or-treating, and sensing the national moment, which he does pretty well, he looked up at me and said, "Daddy, this election is more important than Halloween, isn't it?" Indeed it was. And something happened, I think, about the role of religion in this election. Here's what I think occurred. A lot of people looked at the way religion was used, and some would say abused, in the election, and the way religion has been portrayed in the media now for some time, and in the way religion is currently invoked often in the White House on behalf of particular domestic and foreign policies. And here's what they say. Wait a minute. That's not my religion. That's not my faith. I have faith too. I believe in moral values too, and I don't feel represented. Where am I in all of that? I don't find myself. Well, that's who I'm meeting on the road. People who don't find themselves in the narrow national conversation we've had for way too long about faith and politics. And so on the road, we're meeting, well, here's who's coming. A lot of evangelicals are coming. Now, they're evangelicals like me who don't feel spoken for by a handful of television preachers. They're not part of the religious right. They're maybe part of Brian McLaren's Emergent Church Network, or they're young college students from Gordon College, where we have two of the two of my favorite people on the planet from Gordon College here today, Ivy George and Dick Pirard. They're a new generation. They're in strange places. They're not people that most people know about, but there's millions of them. Millions of progressive, moderate evangelicals across the country. They're all coming out. Catholics who don't feel spoken for by a handful of, I would say, right-wing bishops who say that there's only one issue on which Catholics can vote, which is abortion. No other issue counts. Catholic social teaching is swept aside. They say no to that. Mainline Protestants, to use my neighborhood's language, who have felt dissed by the whole conversation, disrespected, as if mainline Christians aren't even people of faith, not even part of the conversation. Black Christians who say, wait a minute, this has been a very white conversation. Whenever the media says evangelical, they mean white evangelical. They don't mean historic black churches, ever. So they're coming out. Asian Christians, Hispanic Christians are changing our churches across the board. They're coming out. A lot of rabbis are coming. And their Jewish congregations. Young Muslims are coming who want a more tolerant, democratic, compassionate, inclusive Islam. And a lot of young people say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Thanks for making me feel included tonight. We did a town meeting, one of the first ones here in Boston, Trinity Church, Copley Square, on a Sunday afternoon. It was called Beyond Red and Blue, 4 o'clock on a Sunday in January. And we got, 1,000 people came that day. We're having 1,000 or 2,000 every night, no matter where we are. And this young guy said, at the table, the sign of the book, he said, now I'm gay. Thank you for making me feel included tonight. But it's easier to come out as gay in Boston than as religious in the Democratic Party, he said. So this whole wide spectrum of people are coming out. But I'm going to focus today on the evangelicals, which is, of course, our topic. I'm sure John Green has been invoked by somebody so far. John Green's research at Akron, University of Akron, the Bliss Institute. He's done the best demographics in the country on sort of moderate, centrist evangelicals and Catholics. If you don't know his work, please be in touch with John Green. Now, John documents this large number of what he calls evangelical and Catholic, but for our purposes, evangelical moderate centrists, who are not in the pocket of the religious right. Yet the Democrats haven't got a clue of how to reach out and speak to them, and didn't indeed this last time. And they don't see themselves. Here's what happened. Sunday, I don't know if you saw it, I happened to be watching the Sunday morning shows, and Pat Robertson was on with George Stephanopoulos. Pat Robertson said, I heard him on the show myself, he said, the federal judiciary is a greater threat to America than Al-Qaeda. That's what he said. Only Christians and some Jews should be judges in America. And Muslims, well, they're all trying to kill us. So Pat loves to speak about things he knows nothing about. So he lays this out. And so a whole lot of folks say, oh no, and they just kind of wring their hands. The next day the New York Times comes out and says, see, these Christians, these conservatives, these evangelicals. And Louis Lattin comes out in Harper's Magazine. They're jihadists, these Christians. They're theocrats. They want to ram their agenda down people's throats. And a whole lot of folks say, wait a minute. I'm not finding myself here in what Robertson says. He doesn't speak for me. Excuse me for being so academic, he's a wacko. He's not a serious spokesperson. He's not a responsible spokesperson. But then the secular fundamentalists rise up in reaction to the religious fundamentalists, and they begin to characterize a whole bunch of folks, because they're evangelical or religiously conservative, as tied to the right. And people just don't recognize themselves. If you want to read one of the worst articles on religion I've ever read, Harper's Magazine, Louis Lapham, this month. It is the most shrill, one-sided view of religion I've almost ever read. I always say things like this. Religious people do not have a monopoly on morality. Let's make that clear. Religion has been used for the worst of things in our history. The worst things we've done to each other have been in the name of religion and faith. We have been patriarchal, hierarchical, divisive, violent, oppressive. We've been all of that. Yet faith has also been catalytic, transformational, mobilizing, motivational, has shaped whole movements. The slave owners gave their slaves the Bible to turn their eyes toward heaven and away from their plight on the earth. That's why they did it. But in that same book, those same slaves found Moses and Jesus, who became the foundation of their liberation struggle. It's always a paradox. Read Eugene Peterson's intro to his translation of the book of Amos. It's one of the most indicting passages about religion I've ever read. How it has been used to justify our worst crimes against each other. But as Eugene says, the prophetic tradition is always the corrective to that abuse of religion. So the secular fundamentalists label us all in one way, and the religious fundamentalists keep giving them ammunition for their diatribes. Now, I had this experience when I was first at Harvard. Ron Thiemann brought me in to be a fellow at the Center for the Study of Values in Public Life. We had Luke here that first year. It was a wonderful sabbatical year. And there's this group of sort of, left liberal intelligentsia, Harvard, great folks, friends of mine, who have a monthly conversation about politics in a famous person's living room. You would know many of the names. I was invited for the year. Come join us. Come be with us. Come talk with us. I thought that was generous. And so I went. And the second session, they asked me to give a little talk on religion in public life, which is kind of the thing you asked Jim to do. And so I did. I gave, I thought, a reasonable talk. But somebody you would know afterwards raised their hand and said, "But Jim, what about the Inquisition?" I said, "Well, I was against it at the time. I'm still opposed to it. But how about if I don't raise Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge every time you talk about national health insurance?" And he said, "Touche. Okay. Why is it that we have this silly conversation about the worst of our abuses and not have a serious conversation about faith and public life?" There's a conventional wisdom that I find around the country, which is that the religious right has won. They are now in charge. They are now governing the country. That's what many people feel or fear because of the outcome of the election and what has happened since. I'd like to suggest today that I think the reverse is true. I'd like to give you a much more hopeful appraisal of the situation than most people are feeling. Now, you can critique it rigorously. After all, this is our purpose here, and I'm open to your critique. But I've been to the East. I've been to the Midwest. I've been to the South. I've been to Texas. I've been to up and down California, the Pacific Northwest, and the Rocky Mountain states, and back to the Midwest again this week, and Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Calvin College. And I want to make an announcement. I think it's good news. I really believe the monologue of the religious right is finally over, and a new dialogue is just beginning. I feel it every single night in these packed halls and churches and town meetings. Calvin College, 2 nights ago, had a hastily put together event. 1,500 people came. Beforehand, you might not know that George Bush has chosen two places for his commencement addresses, as presidents always do, of both parties. And he's chosen the Naval Academy and Calvin College. So there's been lots of press and controversy at Calvin. You can imagine if this happened to Gordon. So I was asked to meet with some students who had concerns about the image of their school and this political use of commencement, which is what always is the case every year by whoever's in the White House. It's just part of what is done. And I expected a meeting of 10 or 12 students before the major address. There were 300 students and faculty who had a discussion about what to do about George Bush coming. And we had a terrific conversation, and we turned it into how this can be made into an opportunity for Calvin students to have a dialogue about what they think is important in public life up until this event, and perhaps even with the president or with the whole community while this is going on, and afterwards. And it turned into a very hopeful conversation. But I was stunned by 300 students wanting to engage in this kind of topic at Calvin College, along with faculty. You probably saw the press around this Justice Sunday in Louisville 2 weeks ago, where James Dobson and Albert Mohler of Southern Seminary and my old friend Chuck Colson and others were convening a meeting, and they used some very strong language. They said those who didn't support the president's judicial nominees were really not people of faith. And the Democrats who threatened the filibuster of the most conservative of the president's nominees were really doing a filibuster against people of faith, was the language, and that the Democratic Party was hostile to people of faith. And so this created quite a stir, and so there was an alternative Presbyterian service that same day that I was asked to come and speak to, and I went out there, and it was, again, packed full of people. And I just made the historical comparison to one time after Martin King was arrested, he was taken to jail and wrote a very famous letter from a Birmingham jail to the white clergy who were his opponents. The issue was racial segregation and violence against black people. Clear gospel issue. Nowhere in that letter, or any time before or since, did Dr. King ever say his opponents were not people of faith. He appealed to their faith. He challenged their faith. He told them to go deeper with their faith, but never did he say, my opponents are not people of faith. So if the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not willing to attack the faith of his opponents when the issue was racial segregation and violence against people of color, how do James Dobson, Al Mohler, and then Bill Frist, who got involved, say that there is an issue of faith here over a filibuster? Now, I looked through my Bible. We found lots of texts on the poor. I have yet to find one on the filibuster. I've looked very hard. I haven't really found this biblical foundation for this yet. And I think the right really overstepped on this issue. So in the next few days, all of what a number of us were saying back, pushing back, got lots of media coverage. And we had an MSNBC debate with Brother Dobson and Mohler. And I was able to say, Brother James, Brother Al, let's bring our faith into the public arena. Let's talk about what mobilizes and motivates and compels our involvement. But let's not attack each other as not being people of faith. Let's stop the monologue and have a dialogue. And in that show, I was quite startled by how they kept saying, oh, we never said any of those things. Now, it's all on their website. But the point is, they were saying, in effect, we don't want people to think we said that, and we won't say that, and don't worry, we won't say it anymore. Thursday night, the president, in his press conference, to his credit, distanced himself from those leaders of the religious right. He said, those people who disagree with my nominees are, of course, people of faith. This isn't a faith issue. We disagree. And when pressed, he said, I disagree with those who say that those who oppose my nominations are not people of faith. Now, this is one of the first times I've seen a real pushing back of the religious right and a repudiation of the right by, in fact, their chosen political leader. So I think we're making some significant progress now in this conversation. I think it's got to turn into a dialogue from a monologue. I'm going to be here again Monday night, I think in the same room, about God's politics. I'm going to talk more about the book and the book tour, but I'll talk about John Stewart and my encounter with him on this book tour. But, you know, in that show and lots of media shows, we're reaching a lot of people who are outside the sound of our conversations like this, and it's amazing their perceptions of faith. And Alan and I were talking before, you know, the emails after John Stewart, thousands of young people saying, I didn't know that you could be a Christian and care about poverty, or care about the environment, or care about the war in Iraq. I didn't know. So how did Jesus become pro-rich, pro-war, and only pro-American? How did this happen? It's as if there's a tremendous distortion, misrepresentation of our faith, and it's time to take it back. It's time for a rescue operation. And I feel that happening all over the country. I brought with me this statement that I imagine perhaps it's been invoked already, for the health of the nation, an evangelical call to civic responsibility by the National Association of Evangelicals. Now, as Dick knows, who's been fighting this battle for years, the NAE was nothing but a religious outpost or a political outpost of the religious right in Washington, D.C. That's really all it was. Have you seen this yet? The statement. This is a wonderful statement that talks about HIV/AIDS, about the Sudan, about sex trafficking, about the environment, about poverty, about the ethics of war and peace. This is a very strong statement of evangelical social concern. So Ted Haggard of the NAE, the new president, and Rich Cizik, the political director, 2 weeks ago created a firestorm in D.C. by saying the environment was a religious issue for the NAE. That global warming was a religious matter. Ted Haggard has had as he calls it, an epiphany on the issue of global warming. He is a megachurch pastor in Colorado Springs. And Lori Goodstein, in her New York Times article about this, it just shook the nation's capital to have the NAE speaking about global warming and the environment as a religious issue. And what it did, it changed the politics of global warming in Washington, D.C. overnight. Because the global warming constituency, up until this article, wasn't a part of the Bush base. It wasn't on the radar screen whatsoever. When Lori's article came out, the White House called that very day to Rich Cizik and said, "What don't you like about our environmental policies? What would you suggest that we do?" All of this is still under the radar screen. But I had a conversation last week, 2 weeks ago now, in Seattle, a lunch with Rich Stearns, the head of World Vision, and 2 days with their staff and their chapel and their senior people. there's a campaign called the One Campaign, a little thing called One. You can get these bracelets. They're at all the Bono concerts now. Bono, Bread for the World, World Vision. 1% addition U.S. budget for global aid, poverty reduction. This is a big year, 2005. We have the Edinburgh G8 Summit. We're going to have the first ever Church Leaders Summit before a G8. We're going to co-host it with Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury, at Lambeth. Gordon Brown's coming. Rich Stearns is coming. All the American church leaders here, all the Brits there, to set a moral agenda, energy, agency on behalf of key trade, aid, and debt goals at the G8. World Vision is becoming a very progressive organization on global poverty reduction. And at Christian colleges, we have been on this tour to Wheaton and North Park and Point Loma and Bethel and Fuller Seminary, Calvin College. We'll be at Gordon Conwell in the fall. And I am stunned by what's happening on these campuses. I did the Bible Full of Holes at Wheaton College. Wheaton College is the Mecca. This is Billy Graham's alma mater. This is they think, the Harvard of the Christian college world. And so I told this story about this Bible that we, in fact, cut up in pieces, full of holes, one of every 16 verses in the New Testament. One of every 10 in the Synoptics, one in 7 in the book of Luke. We cut it up, and I said, so what's at stake here? Just politics? Social action? No. What's at stake here is the integrity of the Word of God in our lives, our churches, our neighborhoods, and our world. We cut out the poor from the Bible, then sat around and asked each other, how many of us had ever heard a sermon, one sermon, ever, on this topic in any of our churches? Nobody had. What's at stake here, I said to the Wheaton students, is what it means to be an evangelical. So I said, you're known as the premier conservative evangelical school in the nation. So I have a question for you. Are you evangelicals or just conservatives? Could have heard a pin drop in the room. Are you evangelicals or just conservatives? It was an amazing day. I couldn't go anywhere the rest of that day that 100 students were hovering, talking, Q&A. What does this mean? Because everything is at stake if you say you're an evangelical Christian and you ignore whole territories in the Word of God. The connections that they're making, these students, are really two. Wallace, they're really feeling a connection to the black church. Because when I got kicked out of my little evangelical church, that's where I went. Found the other evangelical church in Detroit. And these young students are really being drawn to the black churches. Other place they're being drawn is to Catholic social teaching. David Neff is the editor of Christianity Today. David Neff is virtually an expert on Catholic social teaching. His wife writes reviews for Commonweal and American Magazine. These two places have become points of connection for evangelicals. The right gets it wrong, and we'll talk more about this Monday night, because of this politicizing, this making religion ideological. The religious right was a creation of the political right. There's no doubt about this. There were meetings, mid-70s. There were political operatives, Richard Viguerie, Paul Weyrich, Terry Dolan. They had meetings with Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and they made a deal. They said, give us your names, give us your database, give us your list. We'll make you famous. It was a political deal. So the right is a creation, the religious right's creation of the political right. And so that's why I don't want to just help create a religious left counterpoint, making religion ideological. We just want one party to win no matter what they stand for. A reporter asked me after the election, I guess your vision lost. I said, no, mine wasn't running. What does it mean to have a prophetic faith that can critique left and right from a consistent moral ground? The right gets it wrong by narrowing everything to gay marriage and abortion, which are important issues we'll talk about Monday night, I'm sure. But those aren't the only issues. And I just shout from every pulpit I can find that when there are 3,000 verses in the Bible about poverty, rich, poor people, fighting poverty is a moral values issue too. And the crowds just come to life at that point because that's what they want to say to their nation. The Democrats, though, have a hard time with this language. They're uncomfortable. Poor Howard Dean thinks that Job is in the New Testament. But there's a reassessing going on among Democrats, among progressives, and the thing that they're beginning to understand is that in our American history, every major social reform movement that we have, every single one, was driven and fueled at least in part by religion and by faith. So really this is like John Podesta, former Clinton chief of staff, is saying now all the time in Washington, D.C. in his new think tank. It's the alternative to the Heritage Foundation. He's saying this is that history. There wouldn't have been social change in America without this kind of religion. And most of that, by the way, was evangelical religion. It was evangelical religion, white evangelical or black Christian by and large, most of that, and some Quaker faith in there too. It was religion, faith that drove these movements. The Democrats are beginning to learn how to speak to it. I had a very interesting time last night, pre-event with a UAW activist, who are clearly on the left, and they wanted to have a discussion, a dialogue about abortion. Pro-life and pro-choice UAW activists to rethink the abortion issue. Now in Detroit, that's pretty much the heart of the Democratic Party, and they're trying to rethink how to talk about abortion in a different kind of way. You might know, or you will soon, that a number of Democrats in the House that we've been talking to just last week announced a legislative program. These are pro-life Democrats who are not suggesting their party give up the legal option to abortion, but they want a legislative agenda that would cut abortion, they say, by 95% in this country. Teenage pregnancy, adoption reform, supporting low-income women. They have a whole agenda. I read it on the plane just coming here today. It's an amazing agenda by Democrats to cut abortion in significant ways. If the Democrats start talking this way, indeed, then John Green next time may conclude that they have more to say. I'll just say a couple more things, then we'll open it up after Wallace speaks to us. Maybe make it a bit personal. I was raised in an evangelical home in Detroit, Michigan. Plymouth Brethren was my little sect. They felt they had a direct line back to the Apostolic Church, pretty much. There was the early church, then there was a lot of wasted centuries, and then the Plymouth Brethren showed up, and we were kind of the reincarnation of the early church, pretty much. And I remember I was 6 years old, and my parents were concerned because I hadn't been saved yet. I'm getting up in years. I'm 6, and so we had a very powerful revival preacher coming one night, Sunday night to preach, and the kids had to sit in the front row. We were made to sit there, and this guy pointed his finger. It seemed like right at me, and he said, "Now, if Jesus came back tonight, your mommy and daddy would be taken to heaven, and you would be left all by yourself." It got my attention. And I realized at 6 I would have had a 5-year-old sister to support. So I asked my mother how to fix this thing. And she was always good at fixing things. She told me about the love of God, not the wrath of God, for a little 6-year-old. That God wanted me to be God's child. So I said, that's cool. I signed up and repented of the sin and degradation of my first 6 years, which was actually rather substantial. And so I was, it was a bit shallow, but, as real as it gets for a 6-year-old. And so I got saved, and I went to vacation Bible school, youth group, and the rest. That was my first conversion. Evangelicals have several. My second one was the one that was more important. And it took me out of the church. I was 14, paying attention now in Detroit to my city, listening to my city, reading the papers, hearing the news, hearing about this minister in the South named King or something. And I began to ask, why do we live the way we do in white Detroit when life seems so different from what I'm hearing in black Detroit? People without jobs, without safe places to live, people in prison, people going hungry. You're too young to ask these questions, I was told. They didn't answer the question, so I went in the city and I met the other evangelical church, got taken in by the black churches, and I met kids like Butch. He was working in Detroit. Edison's janitor like I was. My money was being saved for school, his for his family. It was his mother who made the comment about to all her kids, if you can't find your way home and you see a policeman, you run under a stairway, duck around the corner, don't let him see you. Because black kids were being brutalized by white police in Detroit. I heard my mother's words ring in my ear, if you're lost, you find policemen. I realized I'd grown up, me and Butch, in 2 different countries, side by side. I came home one night from all that, and an elder told me, Christianity has nothing to do with racism. That's political. Our faith is personal. But I couldn't push the questions down anymore. So I left. Childhood faith, my childhood church. I joined the Civil Rights Movement and the anti-war movement. Came back to faith later. It's a different story. But I didn't have words to put around that experience that night, and now I do. And every one of these town meetings, I'll get to this somehow and say that God is personal, but never private. God is personal, but never private. And this is the heart, I think, of a genuine evangelical faith. Wherever religion is growing, wherever Christian faith is growing, it's always in places where God is personal, a God who wants relationship. People aren't drawn to doctrines and social teachings and political correctness and somebody's agenda, left or right. They're drawn to a God who wants relationship. But why does this God want relationship? Finney knew, to sign us up for God's purposes in the world. That's why. It's never meant to be about me and the Lord and not the world. It's about the world, signing us up for God's purposes in the world. And so that's the kind of faith I get drawn to, and I find in my Bible a public God. The prophets deal with the stuff of politics, land, labor, capital, equity, fairness, judges, employers, employees, workers, widows, orphans. The prophets deal with a public agenda. And so a whole new generation of evangelicals are finding their domestic policy shaped by Isaiah 65. Read Isaiah 65. It's a vision that talks about housing and health and security and not having your labor be in vain. So I was thrilled when I got a call from one of my students from my course here a couple of years ago. It was in the spring, and she says, I'm on my cell phone. She'd been in the fall course. Now she was a student body president of the county school. On my cell phone, because we're in the president's office, and actually 60 of us are here. Actually, he's left. Actually, we've taken over the president's office. We're on a living wage for housekeepers and security people and food service employees at Harvard. And Ron Thiemann told me, he said, we waste more in accounting at this school than it would take to pay our low-income workers a living wage. And those students catalyzed a movement. The faculty all of a sudden got their courage up, big full-page ad, Boston Globe. Students were inside, and we won that battle. It was the right kind of battle. And the evangelical groups in Campus Crusade and Varsity, they were all there. They were in that battle, fighting for... That's Isaiah 65. Read it. It's about living family incomes, economic security, health care, housing. Budgets are moral documents, Isaiah would suggest. And then I'll close with Micah. Micah is my favorite prophet of national security. Micah is talking about how to find security in a world of terrorism and tyranny. Micah 4, you don't beat your swords into plowshares, your spears into pruning hooks, until everybody has their own vine and their own fig tree, he says. And no one can make them afraid. The simple insight is that it's not just about military supremacy. It's about, we don't have security, I won't have security, my kids won't be safe 20 blocks from the White House, rich nations won't be secure until other nations feel secure. Israelis won't be secure until Palestinians feel secure. There is no security, says Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury, apart from common security. Or Pope Paul saying, if you want peace, work for justice. Micah is saying this a long time ago. So was I surprised? No. To see a whole network rise up from the global south of evangelicals and Pentecostals, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. They first did relief, feeding hungry people. Good work, poor kept growing. Then they did development, micro-enterprise, job creation, terrific work. Muhammad Yunus, micro-lending, all that, great stuff. I work with all of it. Poor kept growing. So now they're doing advocacy on trade, debt, aid. IMF, World Bank, WTO, UN session this fall. When I spoke at their conference in Mexico, an Ethiopian church leader introduced me. His church is 15 years old. 4 million members he has in his church. They have a huge constituency, and the secular UN, as secular as any organization is, the secular UN knows all about the Micah Challenge, as they have constituency all over the world. They're rising up and looking for partners here. So I think we're close to talking again about revival, because as the new, if you saw the Times today, Tony Blair won, but he won't be there for long. And Gordon Brown will probably take over soon, who lived in a manse growing up with his father, who was a Church of Scotland minister. And Gordon Brown had the British obligatory teenage rejection of religion. But now he's inching back. Last time we talked about this, he said, we now have the wherewithal, the knowledge, information, technology, to end extreme global poverty in the world. We could do it now. We didn't before, now we could do it. We know how. What we don't have, he said, is the moral and the political will. He looked across the breakfast table and said, and that's your job. The churches, the faith-based, that's what your job is, to create the moral and the political will. I'm convinced a whole generation of faith-inspired activists is going to do that. And a lot of them are going to be evangelicals, who are really 19th century evangelicals for a 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce another colleague, Wallace Best, professor here of African American Religious Studies. Two things to say about Wallace. The first is that his book is now out in print and available. So the book is Passionately Human, No Less Divine, Religion and Culture in Black Chicago, 1915-1952. So our congratulations on that, Wallace, and we'll look forward to reading that. And the second thing I should mention is that among Wallace's various interests in dealing with African American religion, there's an increasing group of people working to understand global Pentecostalism. And there was a conference here, actually, that Wallace co-organized with Marla Frederick and with Marlon Milner. And the proceedings of that conference and tapes are also available on the web still. So I would encourage all of you to have a look at that. It's another way of bringing into the conversation about evangelicalism this global phenomenon of Pentecostalism. So, Wallace, please come and share your comments, and then we'll open up the floor for questions and discussion afterward. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's my enormous pleasure to respond to Jim Wallis, a man that I greatly admire. I will try to be brief, but there is a lot to say. And the first thing I will say is that Jim Wallis is right. Actually, he's left. But about many things, he is right, which is to say he is correct. And he's back with us here today at Harvard, having been traveling extensively, holding these book signings / town meetings, speaking to large and small audiences, to the rich, to the poor, to the famous, to the infamous, to academics, non-academics, Christians, non-Christians, the religious, and secularists. His message and his vision, what he calls a progressive and prophetic vision of faith and politics, comes at a time when religion infuses all aspects of American political and cultural life. American culture is awash with religious visions, competing religious visions. Indeed, there is a war going on, a cultural war where varying and conflicting interpretations of religion and the role of religion in public life sit at the center. There is a 5,000-pound slab of granite onto which the Ten Commandments have been engraved currently on tour around the country. I don't know if you've run into that, Jim. That testifies to how pertinent are the discussions we have been having over the past 2 days. The legislative and the executive branches of government have recently sought to assert themselves into the private lives of families in the name of preserving, quote, a culture of life, even if it means a violation of the principle of separation of powers and bitterly dividing a family, making one of the most difficult choices a family could be called upon to make. By the way, I should say, we need to ask ourselves if we would have had the national and international spectacle we witnessed with Terri Schiavo, if she was actually a woman named Shaniqua Johnson. There are those who sit in the houses of Congress drawing swords in the name of religion against other Americans who they have dubbed enemies of the people of faith. We are a divided nation, divided by faith and by self-serving interpretations of faith. Jim Wallis, through his work with the Ministry of Sojourners and now with his book, God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It, is calling us to discussion, to reckoning, and to renewal. Yes, he is right about many things. He is right about the primacy of the fight for social justice in the Christian faith. As he argues, religion has historically led the way for social change. Religion is progressive just like progressives are religious. He is right about the war in Iraq. Preemptive strikes on sovereign nations to stage unilateral wars based on misinformation, disinformation, and lies is a moral issue because it is as wrong as it is unwise. And now the cost in lives increases by double digits every day. And the financial cost is closing in on $200 billion with a B. It is a war that was started and now is sustained by the politics of fear at great cost. He is right about poverty. I'd like to see that Bible too, Jim. In the wealthiest nation in the world, millions are poor and hungry. There are millions who have to make the decision every day about whether to get food or to get medicine. It's a national crisis and disgrace. And with thousands of verses in the Bible that talk about the poor, as Mr. Wallace states, poverty is a religious issue. He is right about the Republican Party. and the Democratic Party. The Republican Party has too closely aligned itself with the divisive tactics and rhetoric of the Christian right, and the Democratic Party has been too reticent to talk about religion and morality. The Republican Party and the Christian right are wrong to, in the words of Jim Wallis, define faith and religion solely in terms of individual moral choices and sexual ethics. The Republican Party and the Christian right should not be left alone to determine what constitutes moral values and to shape the public discourse about religion. It is time for the Democratic Party and progressive evangelicals to reclaim their heritage and to take back their faith. It is time for them, for us, to assert ourselves as arbiters of true social change and perhaps true religion. Jim Wallis's message to America is a prophetic message of hope and warning. He evokes the Old Testament prophets a great deal, and perhaps evokes that great U.S. American prophet, Martin Luther King, even more so, and appropriately so. Indeed, if you don't mind my saying so, Mr. Wallace, your work, your energy, and your message leaves us longing for King. King with his Bible in one hand and the Constitution in the other, facing a nation sick almost to death with hatred, bigotry, and discrimination. With the passing of King on that sad April day, something hopeful about America stalled, and perhaps has been stalled ever since. As historian Manning Marable has recently asserted at an event commemorating King's life, there was a brief and shining moment when America seemed to be moving toward the ideal of a multicultural democracy. Yes, Jim Wallis's message reminds us of King, and Jim Wallis's work is reminiscent of King in many ways. Like King, he wants to bend the world toward justice. Like King, he knows that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He knows that we are caught in an inescapable mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. He knows that it is not enough to be morally indignant about effects, social sins. We must be just as indignant about underlying causes, systemic failings. Like King, Wallace knows that spreading democracy around the world is not a selective process. If democracy is good and necessary in the Middle East, it is good and necessary for the Congo. He knows that faith may be personal, but it is not a private matter, and that God bless America is not a verse in the Bible. As one trained in theology at Wheaton College, and yes, we do think that. I remember a time when the question was, what is an evangelical? Mark Knoll, David Bebbington, George M. Marsden, and a few others have, for the most part, settled that question. Now the question is, what does an evangelical do? How does she worship? What are her spiritual and institutional and political priorities? Jim Wallis, I think, targets his message primarily to evangelicals who consider themselves perhaps in the categories of conservative and progressive in one way or the other. There is fault to find on both sides. The progressives need to find their moral voice, and the conservatives need to realize that moral discourse includes but is not in any way limited to abortion and same-sex marriage. All of us need to learn that God is neither a Republican nor a Democrat, and with regard to religion in the public square, dialogue is superior to monologue. And the question is not whether God is on our side, but are we on God's side? Now, the strength of this vision of religion in public life is simple, it is forthright, it is radical, and it is beautiful. Progressive evangelicals, those Wallace is convinced are the ones really concerned about social justice and who primarily make their political home in the Democratic Party, must refute the narrow definition of moral values as espoused by the religious right. Because a truly progressive religion takes an expansive view of morality. Poverty is a moral issue. The environment is a moral issue. Seen this way, social justice is a matter of embracing the priorities and the ethics of Jesus. It is a love ethic that is not comfortable with tolerance. It seeks to understand. It is a love ethic that knows no national boundaries, or religious boundaries for that matter. Jesus loves Americans. He also loves Iraqis. And we are a favored nation, not a favorite one. Jim Wallis's religious vision even has implications for seeing the work for social justice as spiritual practice or as religious ritual. What if we viewed the work we do to eradicate poverty, to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry, to house the homeless, to thwart bigotry, the way we view prayer, fasting, forgiveness, almsgiving, or other ways we worship? Would we then have our hearts and minds truly in line with the principles of Jesus in the matter? Jesus in all aspects of and arenas of our lives? If I have heard Mr. Wallace correctly, this is the heart of the matter. His is a call particularly to evangelical Christians, conservative and progressives, to live out their faith with the common good in mind and in social focus. Only then have we answered the call of the prophet Micah to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. But I'm worried about some things, and I'll close with these thoughts and with these questions. I worry, like many, about exclusiveness, and I'm sure you've heard this before, Jim. Doesn't a vision for moral values articulated in explicitly Christian terms work to exclude those who don't share our faith from this very necessary conversation? I'm reminded of what Illinois Senator Barack Obama has recently proclaimed: we are all connected. We may be divided by faith, but we are connected by citizenship. Neither the Republican Party nor the Christian right have a monopoly on morality, but the same can be said for Democrats, or even Christians for that matter. How do we include other faith traditions into this important discussion without making faith a matter of civil religion? I wonder if a plural America is in a real way a complication for this vision. How do we work through these complications? And what value does James Madison's warning about the separation of church and state hold when we continually call for a fuller involvement of people of faith in government or with government? For instance, progressive Christians don't seem to be complaining that Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and the religious right mix religion with business, to evoke some very old language. We merely wish their religious convictions conform to ours. But what are we saying here? They should be differently religious? In Madisonian fashion, this is the historian in me coming out, I wonder if the mixing is the problem in the first place. I'm not so sure we need a government that is beholden to the progressive evangelical left any more than we need one that is in the grips of the conservative Christian right. If we are concerned about the influence the Christian right has on the Congress and the White House, shouldn't that give us pause when it comes to a political agenda that merely replaces that influence with our own? Finally, perhaps God does not have a politics. The metaphor or the analogy could be inexact. Perhaps framing the discussion this way, we run the danger that God, in our contemporary conversation about religion in public life, becomes politicized. That's my worry. So that the politics of God becomes the politics of God. Thank you.
Thank you very much as well for the comments and for the questions. What we'd like to do now is just open up the floor for questions, discussion. We have some time. There is a microphone that will be passed around. So I would just ask that you raise your hand, and we'll ask you to field questions. And just introduce yourself quickly before you have questions, and we will go from there. Thanks.
Well, my name is Daniel Harrell. I was interested, Mr. Wallace, in your encouragement regarding the sort of move of evangelicalism in America toward a more open and inclusive sort of place, and how that would fit with two other recent phenomenon, the success of the Purpose-Driven Life book, 25 million copies, and Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ.
Well, I've been surprised by the number of book studies that in churches and synagogues that God's politics is provoking. And one young man said, "We're trying to kind of Rick Warrenize this." He said. So it's really true that if you look at how Saddleback and Rick Warren's list of 115,000 pastors was created. It was through this sort of very grassroots kind of book study kind of methodology, which is just in our case kind of happened, but I think it was something that they organized very effectively. What it does, it gets people in the conversation that otherwise haven't been. So you can reach out to your friends, your family, your coworkers, your church members, your neighbors. I'm hoping this does convene a good discussion about, in fact, faith and public life and what our faith means. I was pleased that when Gwen Eiffel had a segment on NewsHour after the election, and Rick Warren and I were both on it together, and he was on because he was there to represent the point of view that said only two issues, abortion, gay marriage, were the motivating issues. I was on to say, the broader issues are also at stake. But when I mentioned poverty, he jumped right in and said, the Bible does require us to address poverty. And now his list of non-negotiables now includes poverty. And Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, who's Robert Kennedy's daughter, writing a book about religion in America, kind of from her dad's experience, interviewed Warren, and then she interviewed me, and she said he's had some kind of epiphany on this issue of poverty. And so I think my hope, I've been having good talks with people like Bill Hybels on this from Willow Creek network, but my hope is that in the Rick Warren world there's some alliances that we can find on issues like HIV/AIDS and poverty. But I hope in those discussions they talk about the questions that Wallace says, because I think those are the right questions, about how do you do this in a way that is democratic, pluralistic, and not exclusionary? Because I think that's the critical issue. There are more Muslims now than Presbyterians in America. And I met, you probably know Reza Aslan, this new book, No God But God. I met him recently, and he talks about the battle within Islam, internal battle, fighting for the soul of Islam. He's fighting for a reformist, democratic, compassionate kind of Islam as a young scholar. And we have those battles internally within all of our faith traditions. How do you make sure that we're not in the public square having competing religiosities, where it's my proof texting against someone else's, or how often someone goes to church, or how often they pray? I think Brian Hare at my book launch at Brookings in Washington, D.C., made a very strong point. He said, we bring our religion to the public square, and there we make what Brian calls a moral turn, and have a moral discourse on politics. Not a kind of competing religiosity test, but a moral discourse. So I bring what I bring because of my faith. But others come, as they've been coming to these town meetings, from different faith traditions or no faith at all, but compelled, motivated still by moral values. How do you have a moral discourse in politics, open, democratic? I would say, how is religion disciplined by democracy? That means you don't say, it's a religious country, so we get to win. You don't say, God spoke to me, and I have the fix for Social Security. Rather, you say, I'm motivated, compelled, brought here by my faith, but Now I must make an argument. I must win a democratic conversation and persuade my fellow citizens about what is best for all of us, religious or not, what will be best for the common good. You've got to win the argument about the common good. And that's, to me, the way religion is disciplined by democracy. Or else, Jerry Falwell and I just have competing proof texting on Bill O'Reilly. And that's not the best way, I think, to do a moral discourse in politics.
What do you say to the evangelical, for either one of you, for whom a view of the world, because for most evangelicals there's a very strong shaping of worldview by virtue of eschatology? What do you say to the evangelical who would say, look, the world continues on a downhill slide, and these efforts that we would make to better it are really wasted time? Should we not focus ourselves more on that which is lasting and ultimate and eternal?
What did they say at Wheaton College?
It's been a while. I'll defer to you because it's actually a question I have.
I talked to Rich Cizik about, with his strong stance on the environment that he's come out with, how this relates to the Left Behind series, which is, in fact, saying what you're saying, that the rapture is imminent and why worry about the environment or anything else for that matter. And Rich, who's very conservative evangelical, said, that's just bad theology. That's not biblical theology. We're called to be stewards. Where do they get off saying that the rapture or someone's predictions about the rapture somehow excuse us from being stewards of God's creation? I just think the answer to bad religion is not secularism, but is better religion. That's kind of the theme of my whole book. The answer to bad religion is not secularism, but is, in fact, better religion. I would say prophetic religion, prophetic faith. So I think we have to attack these points of view really religiously, theologically, not just politically. What's wrong with that theology? 60 Minutes had a focus on evangelicals about a year ago. Morally Safer had this show about Left Behind, and it had this guy who runs the Rapture Institute in his basement. And he's dealing with issues like, when we are all raptured to heaven and meet the Lord in the clouds, will our contact lenses be caught up with us in the air, or will they stay on the car seat as our cars careen out of control and run over the Jews and unbelievers? And this guy's talking like this, and then Morty Safer smugly smiles at millions of Americans and says, and there are 60 million of these people out there, and they're all voting for George Bush. And that's, again, this conversation where one is this wacko Rapture Institute guy, and this smug liberal secularist saying, this is the way religious people really are. And a lot of people say, I'm so tired of this conversation. So let's have a theological discussion about whether the Left Behind series is faithful to a biblical view of what it means to be stewards of the environment. Rich Cizik says it's not.
We'll pull back from the Left Behind a little bit. I think that would be, perhaps in many people's minds, a bit extreme. And talk about maybe...
Well, but successful, hugely impactful on the culture.
For the sake of Harvard University in this gathering. If we pull
You're
back...
above all that cultural success.
If you pull back from that just a little bit, and how would you integrate sort of the vision you're espousing with, say, a more, I don't want to say reasonable, in as much as eschatology is ever completely reasonable, spiritual, or somehow, how would you integrate evangelical eschatology with that which you are espousing as evangelical activism? How do the two go together?
Well, you also mentioned before, not just eschatology, you mentioned this notion of what has eternal sort of worth and value and purposes. Isn't somebody's eternal destination more important than whether they can be benefited by the minimum wage or something, right? Well, my conversion text was the 25th chapter of Matthew. It's one of the few places where Jesus, as Son of God, is standing in judgment. It's a judgment scene. There aren't a lot of them. This is a judgment scene. And those who are there are those, all of whom apparently think they are his disciples. They think they belong to him. Lord, when do we see you? Hungry and thirsty and naked and sick and stranger in prison. And they're confused. They're surprised by this. Now, as Tony Campolo points out, the issue at stake in Matthew 25, none of the doctrinal issues that preoccupy evangelicals are at stake in that scene. Neither is gay marriage, neither is the virgin birth, neither is... What's there is how you treat those whom Jesus calls the least of these. He's saying, in effect, I'll know how much you love me by how you treat them. That's what it says, if we're going to take the text at its face value. So as Jim Forbes says, well, I guess that means that you don't go to heaven without a reference letter from somebody who's poor. That's a nice way to put it. I mean, that's a very powerful counterpoint to this notion that I heard growing up, that it's all about, it's all about your eternal sort of status. This is a wonderful kind of theology for a middle-class, affluent church. But when I met the black churches, I saw no sort of separation here between feeding hungry people and wanting Jesus to change people's lives. There was no... The black church still, with all its faults and frailties, which of course it's still human, but it still is the most holistic expression of Christian faith we've had historically in America. It's the most holistic where social justice and spiritual transformation go hand in hand. That's why, as a white evangelical kid, I was so drawn to it, because here at least it wasn't sort of just a kind of a liberal counterpoint. It was the same language, the Jesus, Bible, all that, but they actually thought that racism was a gospel. I mean, this is the biggest issue going through Paul's missionary journeys. Jews and Gentiles, how they're going to find reconciliation. So I just think that's bad theology. And the way I go after it as bad theology. I don't get into a political debate. I say, where is your biblical foundation for this self-serving America, like the gospel of prosperity? Only in America could we come up with the gospel of prosperity. That if you're rich, it's because somehow you've been blessed by the Lord. If you're poor, you've got some spiritual deficiency. Only an affluent society could create a theology that is at such odds with the gospel. This is not kind of a hot topic in the poorest places on the earth.
Let me speak to that just really, really quickly. The question seems to suggest there's an incompatibility with a certain eschatology and one's life in the world. And actually, if I think about the ethics of Jesus as outlined in the Gospels, no matter if you think it's good theology or bad theology, I don't see an incompatibility with someone perhaps who is preparing for the rapture and actually sort of living out one's faith true to the principles of Jesus on earth. Why would there be an incompatibility? We still have an obligation to clothe the naked, to feed those who are hungry, and so forth and so on. And Jesus is very clear about this in the Gospels. And then if you want to get raptured and go on up, fine. But while you're down here, I think there is a way in which we live that's attentive to the tenets of Scripture.
In fact, that reminds me, when I was growing up, they used to say, Jesus is coming back soon, and when he comes back, what are you going to be doing? And that was to make sure that teenagers weren't caught in a movie theater.
Yeah, right.
or necking in the back seat of their car on Sunday night, And so what will you be doing when Jesus comes back? Well, what you're saying is maybe you'd be caught doing feeding the hungry, clothing the naked. That's what you ought to be caught doing when Jesus returns, And
I am reminded of one thing we used to say at Wheaton, pray for pre and prepare for post. So drug that one out from the recesses.
Yeah. Dig it all back up now.
It's coming back up.
Let me try and frame this question. 3,000 references to the poor in the New Testament.
In the Bible.
In the Bible, excuse me. What I think they're saying is that as God had love and mercy on us down here by sending His Son to save us, so we should have love and mercy for the least of these by going out and helping them, by living among them, by sharing their struggles individually. I'm not sure how Jesus feels about institutionalizing this work. And yet you say faith is public. And I hear your sincerity in saying that. I think back to the war on poverty when we threw millions of dollars at this and built huge agencies and bureaucracies and for many people, many people sort of employed by the state, went to do this work, and it became jobs, it became, careers instead of sort of missions. How do we do this without institutionalizing it, or keeping it alive while institutionalizing it?
I call this the fallback position on the right, which is okay. It shouldn't be just about abortion and gay marriage. You're right. Poverty is there. The Bible's full of verses, but government shouldn't be doing this. This is a matter of individual charity and responsibility and faith-based organizations and all the rest. Jesus really, after all, is a libertarian, and I find that to be not a biblical point of view. I find the Bible has there's a biblical vision for the role of the church. There's a biblical role for government in the Bible too, and Catholic social teaching is best at this. What government's responsibilities are. I'm in agreement with most of that. Subsidiarity, solidarity, solve things on the lowest level possible. I am a strong supporter of faith-based organizations, always have been. All these efforts we've been doing for years. Of course, if we can solve things on that lowest level, as locally as possible, families, communities. But churches can't provide health care for 44 million Americans who don't have it. Can't do that. Social Security worked. It turned elderly poverty it was a great success. Cabrini Green in Chicago wasn't a success. Some of what we did didn't work, so you stopped doing stupid stuff. Other things work. And so you do right now, my focus is how do you make work work? How do you make work pay? Because Republicans and Democrats both can get together around this. 9 million families in America, 9 million families in America work hard, full-time, play by the rules, and are poor. They don't make it. They fall short. The Casey Report, Rockefeller 4, look at it. Working hard, falling short. How do you have public intervention that helps low-income families escape poverty? Child tax credits. I mean, we had this big tax cut for the rich, and in the same bill, there was child tax credits for poor families too, until they were taken out in a conference committee late at night. And so all of a sudden, families that made $10,500 between that and $26,600 lost their child tax credit. Why? To make more available for capital gains tax cuts. The New York Times finally revealed that, exposed it. Two senators, two women, Olympia Snowe, Blanche Lincoln, both women, but Republican Democrat, fixed it, shamed their Senate colleagues, put it back in. We had a meeting with the Bush people 3 days later. They knew we were going to raise this, so they supported the Snowe-Lincoln fix. Then Tom DeLay blocked it. It's been blocked ever since. by the born-again House Republican leader, and so Burger King mom doesn't get child tax credits. I do. She doesn't. My next-door neighbor paid for her house 4 times over in rent. Couldn't afford a down payment. Mom and dad give down payment money to, their middle-class kids, get you started in the housing market. She paid for her house 4 times over in rent. Thelma had good family values. But I was in South Africa for a long trip one time, came home, place is boarded up, she's gone. She went through 4 owners herself. The government, D.C. government, liberal government supposedly, raised her rent, didn't help a low-income family buy her own house. She lost her equity, didn't get the middle-class welfare payment that helped me a lot this year in my taxes, called the homeowner's tax deduction. That saved us this year. It's welfare. I think it's good, but low-income families, it's not rocket science to figure out how you help a low-income family buy a house. It's not rocket science. It's banking policies. So when conservatives come to me and say, there are these behaviors, family breakdown and sexual promiscuity and lack of personal responsibility, and we can just fix those things, we can overcome poverty. Liberals say you got to invest in child care, health care, housing, affordable housing. And I know that neither must live anywhere near poor people. Because, yes, there are behaviors and there are responsibilities that the common good in Catholic social teaching is a combination of personal and social responsibility. But then there are structures and attitudes and laws and policies. And so I don't believe, and I don't know actually many liberal Democrats anymore who think the government is the whole answer. It's partnership, multi-sector collaboration. Private sector has huge responsibilities here. The private sector could do so much. What if Walmart was setting an example for the retail business about how to treat your employees? Fair wages, health care, benefits. What if they were bringing the whole industry up to new standards, not driving it down to the bottom the way they're doing and how they treat their employees? The government can't even do much about that. That's private sector responsibility. Then there's the faith-based sector. Critical. But the Bible has got prophets talking about judges, rulers, employers, public people in public roles who have responsibilities that God's going to hold them accountable to. So it's not liberal Dem, conservative Republican, or libertarian. I think it's a whole different vision that really is critical of all three, in my view.
I wonder if perhaps we may be talking about 2 different and very different levels of involvement here. I'm 100% with you on the idea that the government should be fulfilling these responsibilities as the government of all the people. I'm much less enthused about the idea that we as people of faith look to the government to achieve things that we ought to be doing ourselves. Now we have on one level where you're turning to the government to get maybe school prayers or support for the private schools that churches wish to run, or also we look to them now for support for some of our charities that we aren't willing or able to give money to, but we'll turn to the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives to get this. But at the same time, when we turn to the government to do the work that we ought to be doing ourselves, or that we are doing ourselves to finance it, do we not really then invite the government into domination of our own religious actions? At the same time, we are enlisted by the government to promote, or by the party in power to promote their own interests. Maybe, speaking as a Baptist, I'd much rather see the faith-based initiatives be run by faith-based units and not turn to the government. But at the same time, I want to see the government fulfill its obligations in the area of health care and Social Security. In other words, I see 2 levels of development. I'm much less enthused or sanguine, or whatever word you wish to use, about turning to the government to get financing for our own own faith-based initiatives, and I've seen these things where you have the churches out clawing for grant money like academics like to do it. And I find it's, to me, very, very disturbing. And if we are going to have faith-based initiatives, should we not do our initiatives and not expect the government to do it for us? Now, just to say that, sounds like I'm arguing for this, well, everybody look out for themselves as libertarians. I don't believe that. I'm just arguing for the possibility that maybe we ought not to ask the government to fund our own initiatives or to fund our own values, our own religious behavior. And I think this is a very serious problem, looking at the present Congress and their propensity to pass laws allowing churches to become places where we lobby for political candidates and all that. I think there's some dangers out here. I'd be interested in hearing what your comments are.
Let me respond really quickly, though, because I understand where this question is coming from, and I sympathize because I share some of this concern. But let me paraphrase Thomas Jefferson. Don't trust the man with your religion. Real paraphrase, Thomas Jefferson. So in a sense, there's this sense in which there is a resistance to the politicization of one's spiritual life on one level, I think. And that's part of my questioning. How do we maintain? Because I, for one, Jim, do want to maintain some of that private spirituality that is so meaningful to me in my life. But then I think of King, who you talk about quite a bit. What if King had thought this way? And I think this is part of your point, in a way. I think of the Civil Rights Amendment and the Voting Rights Amendment of 64 and 65, where King, prompted up firmly by his faith, his tradition, and his religion, came to Washington and said, look, some changes must be made here. And he was doing so in some regards, based on that private faith. And in fact, I think that was King's strength. He had an enormous private faith that drove him, but it drove him into the public to fight for the kinds of changes. And so there may be two levels here. There may be a relationship here. We don't want to sacrifice one to the other. I don't want to give the government too much control on how I see myself as a Christian, how I see myself as a person of faith. I'd like my church community to be in conversation with my church community about that. I don't trust the man. But at the same time, I realize that there are real needs in the world that perhaps people of faith must address. And so there is this dance, perhaps, we have to do. And perhaps in our own communities, kind of safeguarding the very thing that you're perhaps fear losing. There are communities that can gird us up in that regard. But I'm not quite sure that a private faith does keep you quiet, because in the case of King, if King had stayed quiet, maybe I wouldn't be sitting here behind this microphone. Who knows?
But I think that on the King's public faith, it was a public faith for all people, not for his own community.
Right.
That's the thing. There's that more universal dimension rather than just for our little group. And that's why King's example is so important.
Right.
Right. Let's stay with King for your question. Let's stay with King. King once said, the churches, now he'd say religion, because King would be talking about the pluralism and diversity among us religiously, but he would say religion it should not be, number one, the master of the state. Religion should not be the master of the state. We don't take power, seize control, and legislate Leviticus. That's not what we do. Second, we are not, he said, the servant of the state, meaning we're not just social service providers. Put the Band-Aids on the sores of injustice. Clean up the mess of bad social policy. Keep pulling bodies out of the river and then never send somebody upstream to see water who is throwing them in. Where we do, Dorothy Day is one of my mentors too. She sits on one shoulder and whispers in my ear, and King sits on the other one. You know. She says, works of mercy, feeding the hungry, care. That's part of what we do. Works of mercy are central. In this town, I know this town, and this town, like others, if the service providers weren't doing what they were doing in this town, Boston would fall apart in about 48 hours. You know, quietly holding things together. That's part of what we do. But he says, we are not the master of the state, not the servant of the state. We are the conscience of the state. That's what King said. The conscience. We tell the truth. Why are so many people hungry? Why did these food programs we put in place a generation ago, pantries, soup kitchens, to be temporary measures? Why have they become a way of life? Why do you have to work in Denver 120 hours a week now at minimum wage to afford any kind of housing in Denver? And Denver is not the worst housing market. So how do we tell the truth? And then, Dick, I know you well enough to know that prophetic stance is what you've done your whole life. The faith-based thing can be a muting of that, a taking away of that prophetic voice. There's an article in the New York Times this week about the leading Hispanic ministry in the country now, Nueva Esperanza in Philadelphia, and all the money they're getting from the U.S. government. And I know them well, and they indeed have quieted their prophetic voice as the money has come in. And I know the director of it. He told me that directly. So that's not what we want by a faith-based initiative. But partnership with public sector can be a critical and important thing. If the city's got some money for showers and shelters, and you have a Methodist church being a shelter, and then you got a secular shelter, should the Methodist church not get money for showers and shelters because they're a faith-based organization? I don't think so. I don't think that's fair. But that can't be for proselytizing. It can't be for you can't be baptizing people in the Holy Spirit with government funds. Showers are okay, But how do you? If we want to compare faith-based initiatives, let's do a broad cross-cultural comparison. Clinton had one in HUD, working with Catholic orders and black churches, doing very good work, providing low-income housing. So Clinton started this. Bush had his view. Gore had his speech in Atlanta. He gave his on the Salvation Army. The best one that I've seen is in Britain. The Labour government has a faith-based initiative, and here's how it works. They have a program now in Britain called the New Deal. It's a job training program. And if you need job training, you got to figure out where the program is offered, go and fill out 25 forms, and then follow through and get your job training. So in Peckham, which is in East London, a neighborhood I've worked in, some kids got to figure out how to get job training. But PCAN, which is the faith-based organization, they go door to door in the housing projects, find kids who need job training, bring them to the office, help them fill out 25 forms, then follow up by phone, then go off and pray for the kids individually after they're all gone. They don't get proselytized, they get job training. What Blair gets is a distribution system for a good job training program. To me, that's a good partnership. That's what we have to strive for, because it works better when we're all kind of involved. But when it becomes politicized, as this one has become, and becomes a substitute, the numbers, we haven't finished this, but the numbers on the new Bush budget are going to mean, and I'm convinced, a net loss of funding for faith-based organizations, not just poor people. A net loss of funding for faith-based organizations. When you cut community block grants the way they are in education and healthcare, a lot of those go to faith-based organizations. It's going to be a net loss of funding for faith-based organizations. And when that comes out, that's going to be a big story.
There's a question right here.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Weimer. I'm a PhD candidate in American Religious History here, and I had the privilege of working with two students this past year who did projects on you and on progressive evangelicalism, and we had rich conversations, particularly with regard to the historical memory, your evocation of the 19th century evangelicals as, in some way, heroes or people who've done this kind of work in the past that we can be inspired by. And your comment just now on Dorothy Day actually brings this point up, in that one of the things we talked about quite a bit was the social gospel. And how the progressive evangelical movement might relate to the social gospel. You know, what the 1910s, the 20s, all these things that were going on, and you know, figures like Rauschenbusch. If there's, if you see perhaps a way to reclaim the evangelical element in those decades that were in some way a continuation of you know, the work that Finney and Tappan and these other people were doing, if that's something you see as eventually wanting to make a part of the story, both the strengths in the 1910s and 20s, and also perhaps the weaknesses.
It's funny, I just had a conversation the other night at Princeton. We did this thing I did with Cornell West, and the moderator was the great, two or three greats, grandson of Walter Rauschenbusch. And he's got a new volume coming out on the anniversary of Rauschenbusch and his significance for us today and what that might mean. And he was fascinating. He's on the faculty at Princeton. And what struck me, he said, you know, all of Rauschenbusch's children and then his grandchildren, they all went in the social justice direction, professionals in various fields, but they all left religion. I'm the first one in the family since my great-great-great-great-grandfather to come back to faith. And I'm putting it back together with faith. But everybody else kind of went off. And what we lost somehow in our family, just our family, was the personal, which you just talked about, the personal connection, spirituality. And he's trying to put back together the social gospel with that kind of personal faith again, that's just one family, and we can't make, but I thought that was very fascinating, that he's come back to a very, I said, how did you come back to faith? He said, well, I had a personal conversion. You know? And so, how do we put together the powerful, transforming agency of personal conversion? That's what I always loved about the black church. The black church just wasn't doing politics, you know, it was personal transformation leading to social justice. So I think we can lose the personal dimension of this. And when we do, we just become, you know, committed social workers. And we kind of have, over time, we kind of lose a lot of the energy and the power and I think the transformative capacity. So how do you keep these two together? That's what the progressive evangelical, black church, Catholic church thing, and the best of the main line in earlier historical incarnations really had. That's what I want to really work at.
Hi, my name is Marla Frederick. I'm assistant professor here of religion and African American studies. I really appreciate your work. I think you fill an important gap in a conversation that's been too long polarized. I have a question about the prison industrial complex. I have two friends who are remarkable men. One who graduated from high school the year behind me, salutatorian of a high school of about 2,800 people, and followed me. I went to Spelman, he went to Morehouse, and got caught in the wrong group for a number of reasons, but is now serving about 15 years in prison. And another friend who's a husband of a mentee of mine from when I taught at University of Cincinnati. And he and his wife have 3 children, and he's now serving 14 years for an outlandish sentence for being in the car when his brother robbed a place, and he didn't know that his brother was going in to do that. I want to know what are God's politics on the prison industrial complex, and how do people across the nation respond to that? And are progressive evangelicals, moderate evangelicals, are they able to see the humanity of many of the men and women who are in prison that the state calls criminal?
We were in Madison recently, Wisconsin, and it was a program sponsored by all the local prison ministries, and they had it in the rotunda of the Capitol, right there in the big rotunda, the state capitol, and and they had a number of guys who had been incarcerated now had come out in transition programs, all church-based, all doing great stuff. And it was a very powerful kind of juxtaposition because, in my view, I think the sort of biblical view of any society, or the truthful view of any society, the Bible suggests to me at least, is known better from the bottom of a society than from the top. Therefore, you know how they say in America, they say, racism is much more subtle now than it used to be. Well, how about in the criminal justice system? In the criminal justice system, racism is anything but subtle. Look at the numbers of arrests and sentencing and incarceration and all the rest. It's blatant, and some would say, well, that's the last vestige, or some would say, well, that just kind of reveals the truth about the society. It's hidden by a lot of other kinds of things. So one reason to look at prisons is that prisons are the bottom of the bottom because you're already poor, often. Maybe you went to Morehouse and were in the wrong car, but by and large, like I tell a story I won't do now, but at New York Theological Seminary has some good programs going inside the walls of prisons. They're teaching MDivs. I'm doing 3 commencements this spring, and one of them is a prison commencement for MDivs coming out of one of the New York State prisons. So I've been up to Sing Sing, and they have a wonderful program there. And it's a great place to do theology or have theological conversation because you're talking about the bottom of the society, the bottom of the bottom. So right there, that's, I think, a great theological context. Secondly, the whole system is I have a lot of interest, I'm sure you all are aware of this, the whole movement of restorative justice. It started with the Maori people in New Zealand, Australia. The Mennonites have been very involved in it. It's a very biblical notion of restoring wrongs done as a society, not punishing people for, in fact, their particular behaviors in criminal interactions. I think it's a much more biblical notion of repairing the breach, restoring the torn fabric that crime always does. But, the crime situation is just so, last week, 2 weeks ago, a 9-year-old kid got shot and killed in a drive-by. He just was in the wrong place, right around the corner from where I live. And he held on for 2 weeks and died a couple of days ago. And just another young black kid shot and killed. I've been that neighborhood for 25 years. It used to not even make the newspapers when a 9-year-old kid got shot and killed. I was once at a White House Hillary Clinton youth violence when she first came. Let's have a meeting, youth violence meeting. While I was in the meeting, I came home, and while I was in there, a kid got killed across the street. Same apartment complex as this kid just got killed again. Yellow tape out on the sidewalk, and yet nothing, This time the mayor was on the front steps having a press conference, and city council and all of the news stations. Why? Because now we got a lot of white people in the neighborhood. It's being gentrified. We got a subway stop. Housing prices are up, and the new residents won't stand it, won't tolerate it. One of my new neighbors, great people, socially concerned white people. They got a new baby. She comes over with her baby and says, "They were shooting last night. They were shooting." She says, "Yeah, we're going to move." I said, "Well, I understand your fears, but you know what? It won't be going on much longer because people like you are here now, and they're going to pay attention finally." They weren't paying attention before. Criminal justice system is such a reflection of the racial, economic realities of our society. So, and the prison system, the privatizing, I could go on and on. The privatizing of the prison system, I think, is one of the worst things that can happen. I prefer there's a restorative justice direction, which the churches are getting behind, and then there's the corporatizing direction, which I think is making prisons profitable. I know prisons in Atlanta, Georgia, where the women are given orange uniforms, and they march out at night to clean office buildings all over Atlanta. And they make nothing for it, and they're taking jobs away from other people, and it's becoming a slave labor operation in a lot of our prisons now.
Can I say something, Marla? I think, Marla, it's good that you raised the question, and maybe that's where we need to begin, because I think perhaps for too long churches have stayed away from the very conversation about the criminal justice system. If I get the numbers correct, I think about close to 30% of African American men between the ages of 26 and 40 are in jail in this country. Those are huge numbers, and quite frankly, I think it works on a number of levels when it comes to the church. The reticence to talk about race, wanted to settle this question that, well, race is much more subtle. We don't see it, so forth and so on. That is the most blatant example of racism I think that exists in our culture. What is happening in the prisons is just absolutely remarkable. And I don't see that we have churches addressing this, and so we need to keep raising this question, raising awareness about what's going on. The incarceration rates are blatantly racist. If you see what actually is happening, it's read as, it's black and white. Who goes to jail for possession of what actually is a starting point in this, and it gets worse. So I think we just really, that's where, Jim, we need some renewal and some revival and some information in that regard. And a real awakening in churches about what's really going on in prison culture. And we need this vision. Particularly, I think that's where your question, how can this vision that Jim is giving would address that? And I think we need it. I really do.
And back to the evangelical theme, a lot of evangelicals do prison ministry. It's one of the places that they tend to kind of gravitate. And when they begin to see what's going on, when they begin to get into relationship with prisoners and families, they get radicalized by that. And that's a very powerful thing.
Our time has come to an end today, but I'd like to take the opportunity again to thank both of our participants and everyone for coming, and also again to thank McDonald for sponsoring the conference this weekend. It's come to a close, and I think it's been a very interesting time for all of us to sit back and reflect, and hopefully we'll be continuing these discussions for a long time. So once again, thank you. And